Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, February 7th, 2021, and today is the day of the Super Bowl, so if you're watching this video instead of that and you're actually moderately interested in football, go ahead and watch that. I don't know if this will be up by the time that the Super Bowl is over. I'm taking a break from it, so I will return back downstairs right after I'm done with this video, but what we're going to be looking at is the 2024 presidential election if the Republican Party pretty much runs a traditional Republican, a moderate by today's standards, and essentially this would mean someone who reminds us very much of George W. Bush, of Mitt Romney, of John McCain, the very long list of Republicans in the modern political history from Reagan onwards have pretty much been these moderate, more traditional, definitely establishment as well, candidates for the presidential election. And as a result, Republicans haven't exactly had too much success after the 21st century. I mean, looking at Donald Trump's performance, the reason why it was so astounding and so shocking is because he was not a traditional Republican. But the point still remains, Donald Trump is the best performing Republican since 1988, the best performing Republican since George H.W. Bush was president. So we're talking about decades going along until Donald Trump became the one of the best performing Republicans. And I know that that's something that is a very surprising feat, I would say, given that Donald Trump just lost a re-election bid. You'd think someone who won by a pretty considerable amount. I wouldn't say a landslide for either of the two candidates, but what I will say is that Donald Trump definitely defied all expectations back in 2016. But let's say the Republican Party decides to drop President Trump, and they look at him as someone who pretty much is I guess you could say, poison to the GOP. We've seen that reaction from a number of members, including Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, who do believe that his efforts have ultimately hurt the GOP's chances at victory in the future. And let's say the RNC decides to put forth and immediately endorse a candidate who is a traditional GOPer. This is someone who reminds us of Mitt Romney. I wouldn't necessarily say Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley anymore, while I may have back in 2018 or 2017 or 2016. I would no longer say that. And also, Josh Hawley just quickly rose to political popularity, just becoming a new senator back in 2018, defeating Claire McCaskill in that midterm election. But I also want to point out, looking at the 2024 outlook, it doesn't look too good for Republicans if they don't go under, a Donald Trump type of messaging system. And we'll talk about why. You see, the Republican Party is currently at a crossroads here, where if they aren't able to fully embrace President Trump, they are going to lose a number of his voters that are very reliable in presidential election years. They aren't reliable when he's not on the ballot, and the GOP has certainly felt the full effect of that down ballot, whether in the Georgia runoff elections or in any special election from 2017 through 2021, or even the 2018 midterm elections. When Donald Trump isn't on the ballot, the Republican Party doesn't perform nearly as well as they could. And that's the main reason, Republicans still cling on to President Trump so wholeheartedly, knowing that they need his support, whether they like it or not. But also, they lose support through Donald Trump. So they're at a very difficult position now where if they don't go with Donald Trump, they could be losing more voters than they are gaining by completely pushing him away from the political party itself. But let's say in this instance, they go with the latter choice, or the second choice, and they go to the full extent of nominating someone who doesn't remind the American public of Trump, someone who isn't too closely tied to the Trump administration. I'm sure that this person would have endorsed them. I don't have any top names. I would say, previously maybe Rubio. The most, I guess you could say, anti-Trump person in the United States Senate is probably Mitt Romney or Lisa Murkowski, but I don't think Romney would run again. But essentially this would be if Romney did run again, but not him personally. Someone who carried his views, someone who didn't like President Trump, and it was a much more moderate and traditional Republican. And we'll talk about why that actually may not be a winning platform for the GOP, but why a Trump platform may not be the winning one either. They would need to find the perfect medium, the same way Joe Biden was able to incorporate a campaign where he was still mentioning words such as progressivism, and Donald Trump was still labeling him as a socialist and a communist, and he was still able to win the election. Now, I'm not one to argue that Joe Biden is by any means, the most progressive candidate that there was in the Democratic primary. I'm sure many of other people that ran, senators, representatives, governors, anyone really that ran against Joe Biden, I'm sure many of them were more progressive per se. But you do also have to point out, Joe Biden definitely did mention the progressive word, dropped it a few times, that Hillary Clinton was really afraid to say following the primary. So Joe Biden certainly, met that fair medium where he was able to win over voters that were previously solid for the Republican Party. We're talking about suburban white voters in the Atlanta metro area. Also with that, while being able to appeal to some of those more, former Republicans, independents who had voted for Republicans. So let's just say former Republican voters, while also driving up turnout amongst minority groups, and that largely had to do with people of color around the country that were really able to just go into these states and drive up the turnout in the inner cities, Atlanta area, Phoenix area, let's see, Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, wherever you look, really. The reason why Joe Biden was able to win in some of these states was because minority turnout was at an all-time high, and he was able to win over some of those suburban voters that were lost at the expense of Trump's campaign. But now that we have a traditional Republican, what you can expect is that the electoral map might actually return to a vaguely similar one, that reminds us of the 2012 election. Well, the last moderate Republican to run was Mitt Romney, and of course, we know that he lost the election, but keep in mind he was running against one of the strongest political candidates that we've seen in modern history. I mean, Barack Obama was a very strong candidate in the 2012 election, a very strong one in 2008. The Romney campaign thought they would have had it in the bag in 2012, but they lost by a larger margin than Donald Trump did in his re-election bid, and a larger margin than Hillary Clinton did in her first election bid, or technically her second. But looking at the 2024 map, what I said, we could see a return of some of the states that were previously Republican states going back into the Democratic column. And, before we get there, let's characterize the likely states just so we aren't spending too much time on different regions of the country that, we're going to ultimately get to by the end of the video. The first thing I would like to point out is that Maine at large and Maine's first district will likely return back to being safe. Donald Trump's influence went to an extent, through the Northeast, through the Midwest, but he certainly lost voters in different regions. But where, removing Donald Trump from the equation helps the Democratic Party heavily, Maine at large. Maine's second congressional district, which we will get to in a moment. And also, just because we are returning to a traditional type Republican, I by no means expect Minnesota to narrow up. Traditional Republicans didn't have much luck there either in previous elections. Trump lost it by 7 points. In 2016, he lost it by 1.5%. In 2012, Romney lost it by 7.7%. In 2008, by 10.2%. Even in 2004, by 3.5%. In 2000, by 2.4%. And it was just a Democratic state, the only state that actually didn't vote for Ronald Reagan in 1984, the only state in the entire country. So looking at Minnesota, a very long history of voting with the Democratic Party, 2024 would be no different, especially if the Republican Party returns to their old normal, if that makes sense. So moving past Minnesota, the next likely state would also be Virginia. I mean, it's just 2 Democrat in Northern Virginia for the Republicans to come back. The Virginia GOP certainly has faded into irrelevance. I mean, they went from having a supermajority at the start of the Trump presidency in the state delegation in the state of Virginia. They went from being competitive on the governor level to being competitive on the Senate level to absolutely being obliterated in the 2017 governor election, obliterated in the 2018 Senate election, the 2020 Senate election. The results here ultimately show that the Democratic Party has dominated this state and will continue to do so, even with a return of a traditional Republican. And the next likely state that we can cover is the state of Colorado and, neighboring New Mexico. These 2 states are going to be considered likely. I really don't think that the GOP has too much of a chance here in the future. While they may have had a chance in the past, ultimately these states have just shifted too far to the left to be considered competitive in 2024, at least in the swing state sense, where we can't determine a winner or have a general idea of who the winner could be straight off the bat. But the Republican Party also has some of these likely Republican states, but unfortunately for them, they are already states that I've characterized as safe for the GOP. These are South Carolina and Alaska. These are states that are traditionally safe, but due to, recent shifts, they have become more and more pro-Democrat. We can actually take a look at the election history in these states if we use the little compare tool, which is very, very helpful. Let's compare 2012 to 2020. South Carolina actually shifted to the right, so Donald Trump outperformed Romney, and in 2008 shifted to the right as well, outperformed McCain, but did not outperform Bush by any means. But looking at Trump's performance here, he actually outperformed the most previous Republican, but Alaska shifted to the left by 4 points relative to 2012 and 11.5% more Democratic since 2008. Even 2016, it shifts 4.7% more in favor of the Democratic Party. So looking at the results here, ultimately, the Democratic Party will still be able to, they will still lose the state of Alaska. They will still lose the state of South Carolina, but I honestly could see it becoming a likely Republican state. But I would also consider Indiana and Missouri remained in the safe Republican column. Despite these states being closer with Romney and McCain, it's largely due to the fact that Barack Obama came very close in 2008. But honestly, I don't expect Democrats to do the same type of thing in 2024. They're by no means competitive entering into the future. So those are the likely Republican states. Let's move on to one big one. I'm sure you've noticed, the state of Texas. I think with a traditional Republican, someone who isn't Trump-esque, someone who isn't closely tied to President Trump, certainly could win Texas by a John Cornyn type margin. You see, when you're looking at the 2016 election results in Texas or in some of the other states that were previously solid for the Republican Party, Georgia and Arizona, sometimes Republicans down the ballot may not necessarily be senators, because what we've seen is that they're so closely intertwined with the presidential election. But known Republicans in statewide races typically do better than Donald Trump. And that's largely due to the fact that the opposition here wasn't to the Republican Party more than it was an opposition to Donald Trump. Donald Trump was someone who completely changed the way that politics was looked at, the way that people campaign, and ultimately he lost a significant amount of support in these regions alone. If you're looking, let's go back to the compare tool, even though I just got rid of it. Relative to 2016, Texas got 4 points more Democratic. Relative to 2012, it got 10 points more Democratic. The problem here remains that the GOP is losing support because of President Trump, but I think could win it back. With a moderate / traditional Republican, because even with changing demographics, I think it'll be closer, much closer than it was under Mitt Romney. But if you're looking at the margins, they don't lie. If you're looking at the margins, there's a reason why Romney won Texas by 15.8% and Trump only won it by 9 points and then went on to win it again by 5.5%. The state is narrowing, but a traditional Republican can certainly temporarily reverse it, enough that it's a likely Republican state again 4 years later. So Texas goes into the likely Republican column. Joe Biden currently has 219 electoral votes. Now, the reason why I have Kamala Harris up there as well is because she could potentially be the nominee if Joe Biden chooses not to run. We have yet to see a full announcement from him, but chances are he is going to decide to run for president of the United States again. I mean, it makes sense. He's the incumbent. But also, now that we have states that are characterized as likely, let's move into the states that I would characterize as lean, and we'll start off in favor of the GOP. This comes out of the state of Iowa, the state of Ohio, two states that were won by pretty considerable margins in 2020. Trump won Ohio by 8.1%. He won Iowa by 8.2%. The margins of victory here were very, very large. And if we compare it to 2012, the last time Democrats won these two states, I want to point out that, this margin is a very significant shift. In Iowa, it got 14 points more Republican than 2012. Ohio got 11 points more Republican than 2012. They shifted significantly to the right. Significantly to the right. And I think that while Republicans won't be able to replicate Donald Trump's support with someone who isn't like Donald Trump, the Republican support here is too much for the Democrats to overcome, at least at initial glance, which is why I would characterize these states as lean for the Republican Party. And also another state that I would characterize, actually not necessarily as lean. We'll get to that one in just a moment because we can talk about that soon. The next state I would actually characterize in the lean column is for the Democratic Party. And these are states that I think will be pretty solid, not necessarily solid, but relative to 2020 could be pretty solid depending on who the Republican nominee is going to be. And I know that this is something that isn't going to be largely appreciated just by some members who want to see a competitive election. But the truth stands that Donald Trump was one of the best performing Republicans in the Rust Belt for quite some time. And while I do think Democrats will have trouble in the Rust Belt, meaning it won't be initially safe and they will immediately have to fight for it, I think if the Republicans choose to run someone who's a traditional Republican, they are going to see a return of Romney and McCain losses in these states, because the only Republican who's been able to tap into these voters were Donald Trump type candidates. Donald Trump himself, in 2020, John James almost won the Senate election here because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was able to completely change the Rust Belt, to change the way that Rust Belt politics worked forever. And I think that the Republican Party is going to try to find someone like Donald Trump who can win here. But if they nominate someone who's a traditional, who's a moderate Republican, who doesn't appeal to these voters the same way, who isn't, pushing the same type of message that Donald Trump had, the same type of economic prosperity message that was crucial to winning over the Rust Belt in 2020 and 2016, Donald Trump did fairly well in 2020. I think these states could actually return to being lean for the Democratic Party. So that's pretty much it for the lean Democratic states, only those 3 states, and that puts the Democrats at 263 electoral votes. Now, spoiler alert, they will not be in the 270-plus column this evening. That's not how this is going to go. We're going to move into the tilt states, and then we're going to finalize on the states that ultimately are considered swing states moving past this election. So the tilt states, let's start off with the tilt. Actually, we do have, no, we don't. That's a swing state, so I wrote that down correctly. The next state that we have, or not state, the next district that we have in the tilt column is Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, I would consider this one to be a tilt Democratic state. And for the GOP, I actually forgot to characterize this one as lean, but just treat it as if it is. I just characterize it as lean, not going to change anything. It's one electoral vote. But this second district, could definitely get a lot closer because Donald Trump is no longer on the ballot, and ultimately would put the Republicans one electoral vote closer to 270 electoral votes. And then the next state that I would characterize in the tilt column is actually pretty surprising. Despite demographic trends, wrong word, same graphic type of thing, demographic trends in these states, I think that with a traditional Republican, someone who's Romney and McCain-esque, they could win back plenty of those suburban voters. It may not be enough to win the states by likely margins, but certainly win them by at least a tilt margin, which is what could happen in 2024 if the Republicans choose someone who isn't Donald Trump or isn't a reminder of Donald Trump. Because the main reason why this region rapidly shifted to the left was because of President Trump. His impact here was all negative. Even in 2016, when he won the states, they were narrower than where they were back in 2012. There's a reason for that. Donald Trump is not popular in these states. He was chosen because Hillary Clinton was the alternative. When voters were provided with a more likable candidate like Joe Biden, which is proven fact, he's a more likable candidate based off public approval rating, they bit. And they chose Joe Biden to be the next president of the United States. But let's say we run someone who's, Republican, that's a traditional Republican, and we also run, a traditional type of Democrat like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. Well, we could ultimately end up seeing that these states return back to their previous Republican characteristic, not by a large margin, though. I think that'll be very, very close, but it's not out of the question for the GOP to win it. In fact, I think that they may be the favorites if they completely push away Donald Trump and they can tap into this previously solid Republican voting base that they've had for sometimes decades. So looking at the 217 electoral votes for the GOP and the 264 for the Democratic Party, you initially think this is a good rating for the Democratic Party. This is something that's good. And you can't argue that it isn't. All they need is one more state besides New Hampshire to win the election. But also, it's going to be very difficult. When you're working with a traditional Republican, they do fairly well in some of these states. Romney still won the state of North Carolina despite losing the Electoral College map by a larger margin than Donald Trump. He won it by 2 percentage points in 2020. Trump won it by 1.3 points. So Romney had a better effect in the state of North Carolina. He was able to win it by a larger margin. And I think ultimately that this state could definitely be a swing state moving through the election. But, looking at the state itself, absolutely. Based off the demographics, based off of everything that we've seen so far, I will say North Carolina certainly could be a swing state moving past 2024, especially if Republicans nominate a traditional Republican. And I think this also would bring back some of the more traditional swing states that we are used to seeing. I'm talking about New Hampshire. I'm talking about Nevada. States that are traditionally competitive, that Donald Trump didn't necessarily make competitive. Now, Nevada had shifted to the right narrowly. And very narrowly, if we look at the margin, 2016 versus 2020, Nevada got 0.017% more Republican, so nothing super significant. But because we are going to see pretty much a shift away in terms of Latino support for the GOP, but an increase in white support for the GOP, I think Nevada could definitely become back to being a swing state. I don't know why I'm treating it like it wasn't in 2020. It will remain a swing state for both parties. So that's 26 electoral votes. I've yet to characterize the state of Florida, and I had a very difficult time deciding how Florida was going to go. Initially, I said this would probably be a tilt for the GOP given Donald Trump's election performance. And part of me thinks that's right. But also you have to realize that this state is always competitive. It really doesn't matter who it is. Donald Trump was an exception because he was able to win over more minority voters than previous Republicans. But he also lost white voters. He lost counties with large populations that, sometimes had shifted to the left. But the loss of Hispanic support for Joe Biden was what ultimately dealt him the significant loss in the state of Florida. So looking at the results, I still think that the Republican Party has a narrow advantage in the state of Florida. I think I'm going to characterize it as tilt for the GOP, but I don't think they will win by nearly as much as Donald Trump, and they are still going to have trouble. They are still going to have to fight for the state, but Florida definitely leans a little bit to the right. While they may not always vote for the Republican Party, they certainly have skewed that way in the past decade, and it's going to be very difficult at some point to argue that Democrats are going to be the favorites to win in this state. I think that with a traditional Republican, it will be much closer than it was for Donald Trump. I'm expecting a drop-off in terms of Latino support, but it'll still probably be lean for the GOP given the ability to win back states that have a very large retiree population. Florida, absolutely, and very large white population, absolutely. And also Florida combined with a number of conservative, socially conservative at least, Hispanic voters, it definitely could be enough to win the state, even by a tilt margin. So ultimately, the election is still close. I mean, what's new? Presidential elections always come down to the wire, leaving us with 26 electoral votes that are considered to be swing states, but really there could be more. This is just where I would say, if the Republican Party chooses to run a traditional GOP candidate, this is likely what the result would look like, at least in my opinion. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.